Picture this. A middle-aged woman standing on your front lawn at 7 in the morning, measuring the exact height of your mailbox post with a tape measure, her phone already dialed to the HOA hotline. Now imagine that same woman, 6 months later, sitting in a lawyer's office with her hands trembling as she realizes that every single fine she's issued, every threatening letter she's sent, and every power move she's made has just backfired in the most spectacular way possible. This is the story of how one homeowner turned the tables on an HOA board member who thought she was untouchable, and the legal twist that nobody saw coming. Where are you watching from? Please feel free to leave a comment below, as you are about to witness one of the most satisfying takedowns of HOA overreach you will ever hear. Because what started as weekly fines over the most ridiculous violations you can imagine ended with a complete restructuring of an entire HOA board, thousands of dollars in refunds, and one very humbled neighbor who learned that abusing a position of power comes with consequences she never anticipated. The weapon? A little-known clause in state HOA law that this homeowner discovered buried in 70 pages of legal code. The result? A neighborhood revolution that exposed years of selective enforcement, personal vendettas disguised as rule compliance, and a paper trail so damning that even the HOA's own lawyer recommended immediate settlement. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand just how sweet this victory was, you need to know how it all began. And trust me, it started over something so petty you won't believe it's real. Marcus Chen had always been the kind of person who believed in following rules. When he and his wife, Jennifer, purchased their dream home in the Meadowbrook community in suburban Phoenix, they'd done their homework. They'd read through the HOA covenant documents, all 43 pages of them. They'd attended a board meeting before closing. They'd even introduced themselves to the neighbors on either side of their property and brought homemade cookies as a gesture of goodwill. Marcus was a software engineer who valued systems and order, while Jennifer worked as a pediatric nurse with a natural inclination toward harmony and avoiding conflict. They were, by all accounts, model citizens ready to be model homeowners. The Meadowbrook community was exactly what they'd been searching for. Built in 2008, it featured 217 homes arranged around a central park with a community pool, tennis courts, and walking trails that wound through carefully maintained desert landscaping. The HOA fees were reasonable at $215 monthly, and the neighborhood had a reputation for being well-managed and family-friendly. Children rode bikes in cul-de-sacs while parents chatted over fences. Weekend mornings brought the smell of grills firing up and the sound of lawn mowers humming in synchronized suburban symphony. Their home was a beautiful 4-bedroom Spanish-style property with terracotta roof tiles, cream stucco walls, and a front yard that featured native desert plants requiring minimal water. The previous owners had been meticulous, and everything was in pristine condition when Marcus and Jennifer moved in on a warm Saturday in March. They spent that first week unpacking, arranging furniture, and introducing themselves to more neighbors. Everyone seemed welcoming, though Marcus noticed that several people lowered their voices or changed subjects when one particular neighbor walked by during their conversations. That neighbor was Diane Pemberton. But here's a question for you. Have you ever met someone who treats a volunteer position like they've been appointed supreme ruler? Drop a comment if you've dealt with someone like this, because Diane was about to take petty authority to championship levels. Diane lived 4 houses down in a home that looked like it had been frozen in time from the day she'd moved in 12 years earlier. Every blade of grass stood at regulation height. Every flower bed was maintained in perfect symmetry. Her white vinyl fence gleamed without a single scuff mark, and her mailbox looked like it had been installed that morning, despite being over a decade old. She was 56 years old, recently retired from a career in banking middle management, and had served on the Meadowbrook HOA board for 9 consecutive years. For the past 4 years, she'd held the position of compliance director, a role she'd essentially created for herself after convincing the board that the neighborhood needed someone dedicated full-time to monitoring rule violations. The problem was that Diane didn't just monitor violations, she hunted them, she cataloged them, she obsessed over them with the intensity of someone who finally found a purpose after years of feeling overlooked in her previous career. Other board members worked regular jobs and handled HOA business in their spare time. Diane had made HOA enforcement her full-time occupation, patrolling the neighborhood each morning with a clipboard, a camera, and a measuring tape that she carried like a weapon. Marcus first encountered Diane 3 days after moving in. He was in the garage organizing tools when a knock came at the front door. Jennifer answered to find a woman with precisely styled gray hair, pearl earrings, and an expression that suggested she'd already found something wrong. "Welcome to Meadowbrook," Diane had said, though her tone contained no warmth whatsoever. "I'm Diane Pemberton, Compliance Director for the HOA Board. I wanted to introduce myself and remind you that all exterior modifications require architectural approval before implementation. I noticed you have moving boxes visible through your garage door. Section 4.7 of the Covenant states that garages must remain clear of visible clutter when doors are open. You have 72 hours to address this." Jennifer, ever the diplomat, had smiled and thanked her for the information, assuming this was just a friendly heads-up. Marcus learned about the encounter when he came inside for lunch. They'd laughed about it, thinking it was an overzealous welcome that would be the extent of Diane's involvement in their lives. They'd moved the boxes that afternoon, not because they were particularly worried, but because they were going to organize the garage anyway. That was their first mistake, showing Diane that they would respond immediately to her demands. Have you ever made someone think you're an easy target by being too compliant? Because Marcus and Jennifer were about to learn that lesson the hard way. The second encounter came a week later. Marcus had placed their trash bins on the curb the night before pickup, which was standard practice in every neighborhood he'd ever lived in. The next morning, he found a formal violation notice tucked into his front door. The letter, printed on official HOA letterhead, informed him that trash bins could only be placed at the curb after 6 p.m. the evening before pickup and must be returned to storage within 12 hours of collection. His bins had been placed at 5:45 p.m. Diane had apparently been monitoring his house specifically, waiting to see if he'd comply with the exact timing requirement. The fine, $25. Marcus paid it, again thinking this would be the end of it. He set a reminder on his phone to ensure he'd never place bins out early again. Jennifer suggested they laugh it off as an eccentric neighbor quirk. After all, $25 wasn't worth creating neighborhood tension over. They were still settling in, still wanted to build good relationships, still believed that following the rules precisely would keep them out of trouble. That was their second mistake, not recognizing the pattern that was forming. Over the next month, 3 more violations appeared. One for a garden hose left visible on the side of the house after Marcus washed his car. One for a package that sat on their porch for 6 hours before they returned from work to retrieve it. One for holiday decorations that remained up 2 days past the covenant-mandated removal date, even though Marcus had taken the day off work specifically to take them down, but had gotten called into an emergency meeting. Each violation came with a $25 fine. Each notice was delivered within hours of the supposed infraction. Each letter was signed by Diane Pemberton, Compliance Director, and included highlighted sections of the covenant documents with the relevant rule violations clearly marked. Now ask yourself this. At what point does rule enforcement become harassment? Keep that question in mind, because it's about to become very important. By the end of their second month in Meadowbrook, Marcus had paid $125 in fines. He'd started keeping detailed records of every action he took regarding his property. He photographed his trash bins with timestamps. He created a checklist for any outdoor maintenance. He'd even printed out the entire HOA covenant and highlighted every section that could potentially apply to his property, studying it like he was preparing for a final exam. Jennifer had started to notice that other neighbors didn't seem to be held to the same standards. The house directly across from Diane's had a broken fence slat that had been visible for weeks. 2 houses down, someone had an RV parked in their driveway despite the covenant rules prohibiting this. A home 3 streets over had completely repainted its front door a color that wasn't on the approved list. None of these violations had been addressed. None of these homeowners were receiving weekly notices and fines. It became clear that Diane had decided Marcus and Jennifer were going to be her special project. The pattern of harassment escalated from annoying to absolutely absurd during month 3. Marcus received a violation notice for excessive noise because he'd used a leaf blower at 9:30 on a Saturday morning. The covenant stated that loud equipment couldn't be used before 7 a.m. or after 9 p.m. Marcus had been well within the acceptable time frame. Still, Diane's notice claimed that the specific model of leaf blower he'd used exceeded the decibel limit for residential use, a provision Marcus couldn't find anywhere in the actual covenant documents. When he attempted to contest this fine by attending the monthly HOA board meeting, he discovered something troubling. The board consisted of 5 members, a president, vice president, secretary, treasurer, and Diane as compliance director. During the meeting, when Marcus politely questioned the leaf blower violation and asked to see the specific covenant section addressing decibel limits, Diane had produced a stapled packet of what she called supplementary enforcement guidelines that had apparently been created by the previous board 4 years earlier. These guidelines were never mentioned in the official covenant documents. They'd never been distributed to homeowners. They existed in a 3-ring binder that Diane kept in her possession, and she referenced them frequently to justify various enforcement actions. When Marcus asked if he could have a copy of these guidelines, the board president, a tired-looking man named Robert, who seemed more interested in checking his phone than running the meeting, had waved vaguely and said the guidelines would be made available on the HOA website eventually. They never were. Here's something to think about. How many rules in your community exist only in someone's mind or personal notebook? Comment below if you've ever been cited for violating a rule you never knew existed. The fine stood. Marcus paid another $25, bringing his total to $150. But more importantly, he left that meeting understanding that Diane operated with essentially no oversight. The other board members were volunteers with full-time jobs who'd grown tired of the position and were counting down until their terms ended. Diane was the only one with time and energy to dedicate to HOA business, which meant she'd slowly accumulated unilateral authority over enforcement decisions. She was, in effect, the HOA in everything but title. Jennifer started to dread coming home. Every day brought anxiety about what might be waiting on their doorstep. Marcus began to notice Diane's morning routine. She'd leave her house at 7 a.m. sharp with her clipboard and walk the neighborhood for roughly 90 minutes, taking photographs and making notes. She'd pass by the Chen house at least 3 times during each patrol, slowing down each time to scrutinize every visible element of their property. It felt like living under constant surveillance. The violations continued with metronomic regularity, a fine for their mailbox being a 1/4 inch too far from the curb, a fine for a small oil spot on the driveway that Marcus cleaned the same day, but apparently not quickly enough, a fine for having a ladder visible in their side yard for 48 hours while Marcus repaired a gutter. Each infraction came with the same $25 penalty, and each one was documented with photographs, timestamps, and highlighted covenant sections. Here's a question that sounds familiar. Have you ever felt powerless against someone with just a tiny bit of authority? Because that's exactly where Marcus and Jennifer found themselves. By month 4, they'd paid $300 in fines. Marcus had begun to research options. He'd read through Arizona state HOA laws. He'd consulted the covenant documents so many times he'd practically memorized them. He'd discovered that while individual fines seemed small, the covenant allowed the HOA to place a lien on properties with unpaid violations, and the accumulation of violations could technically result in legal action to force compliance or even foreclosure in extreme cases. Diane knew this too, and she'd begun to mention it. The turning point came on a Wednesday morning in late June when Marcus was running late for an important presentation at work. He'd placed the trash bins out at 6:15 the previous evening, well within the acceptable window. He'd double-checked the placement distance from the curb. He'd even made sure the lids were properly secured. But when he walked out to his car that morning, he found Diane standing in his driveway with her measuring tape extended, measuring the exact angle at which his bins sat relative to the curb. "These are positioned at a 47-degree angle," she'd announced, not even looking up at him. "Bins must be placed parallel to the curb or perpendicular. This constitutes improper placement." Marcus had stared at her, genuinely at a loss for words. The bins were slightly askew because the curb had a natural curve at that section of the street. There was no way to place them that would satisfy a strict parallel or perpendicular requirement. "Diane," he'd said, keeping his voice level despite the rage building in his chest, "I need to get to work. The bins are at the curb for pickup. They're not blocking anything." "Section 8.3, subsection D," she'd replied, pulling out her phone to photograph the supposedly offending angle. "I'll have the notice ready by this afternoon. That's another $25. What would you have done in that moment? Would you have argued? Would you have knocked over the bins in frustration? Drop your thoughts below, because Marcus made a choice that would change everything. Instead of arguing, instead of letting his anger show, Marcus said, "Okay," got in his car, and drove to work. But during his lunch break, he didn't eat. Instead, he spent an hour searching for HOA attorneys in Phoenix. He read reviews, checked credentials, and made a list of 3 firms that specialized in homeowner disputes with HOA boards. That evening, he explained his plan to Jennifer. They would pay one more fine to keep things civil while Marcus consulted with a lawyer. They would document every single interaction with Diane going forward. They would build a case that this was harassment, not legitimate enforcement. Jennifer was hesitant about the cost of hiring a lawyer, but she was also exhausted from the constant stress. The thought of returning home had become something she dreaded rather than looked forward to. Their dream home had become a source of anxiety. They agreed to move forward. Marcus scheduled a consultation with an attorney named Patricia Valdez, whose firm's website indicated extensive experience with Arizona HOA law. The consultation fee was $200, which felt steep, but Marcus had already paid $325 in fines over 4 months. If Patricia could help him stop the bleeding, it would be worth the investment. The consultation was scheduled for the following Tuesday afternoon. Marcus took a half-day off work and drove to Patricia's office in downtown Phoenix, a modern building with floor-to-ceiling windows and the kind of professional polish that suggested competence. Patricia turned out to be a woman in her early 50s with sharp eyes and a manner that was both friendly and intensely focused. Marcus laid out everything: the timeline of violations, the selective enforcement he'd observed with other neighbors, Diane's morning patrols, the supplementary guidelines that seemed to exist in defiance of transparent governance, and the growing feeling that this had crossed from enforcement into personal targeting. Patricia had listened without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When Marcus finished, she asked one question: "Do you have documentation of all of this?" Marcus had pulled out a folder containing every violation notice, every photograph he'd taken of his property showing compliance, every paid fine receipt, and a log he'd been keeping of Diane's patrol schedule and the violations issued to him versus the lack of enforcement he'd observed with other properties. Patricia had flipped through the documents, and for the first time she'd smiled. "Mr. Chen," she'd said, "I think we need to discuss Arizona Revised Statute 33-1803. Have you ever had someone say something that completely changed your perspective? Hold that thought, because this statute was about to become Marcus's secret weapon." Patricia explained that Arizona law required HOA boards to follow specific procedures for enforcement actions. Violations had to be issued uniformly and without discrimination. Homeowners had the right to appeal violations before fines were levied. Rules had to be clearly documented and accessible to all residents. And most importantly, board members who engaged in selective enforcement or harassment could be held personally liable for damages if their actions could be proven to exceed reasonable governance. The problem, Patricia had continued, is that most homeowners don't know these protections exist. They pay fines because it's easier than fighting, and they don't realize that patterns of selective enforcement constitute a legal violation by the board member. But you've documented everything. You have evidence of other properties with violations that haven't been addressed. You have a pattern showing frequency and targeting that goes well beyond normal compliance monitoring. She'd paused, reviewing one particular document. The supplementary guidelines packet that Marcus had photographed during the board meeting. These guidelines, Patricia had said, tapping the photo with her pen, were never properly adopted according to state requirements for HOA rule changes. They can't be enforced. Every fine issued based on these guidelines is illegitimate. And suppose we can prove that Ms. Pemberton knew these guidelines weren't properly adopted, but continued to use them for enforcement purposes. In that case, we might have grounds for a claim of intentional misconduct. Marcus had left that consultation with a strategy, a timeline, and a sense of hope he hadn't felt in months. Patricia agreed to take his case on a contingency basis, meaning she'd only collect a fee if they won a settlement or judgment. Her confidence in the case suggested she believed the outcome was inevitable. Phase 1 of the strategy was simple. Marcus would continue to document everything, but he would also send a formal written request to the HOA board demanding access to all board meeting minutes for the past 5 years, all financial records, all enforcement statistics showing how many violations had been issued to each property, and official copies of any supplementary rules or guidelines being used for enforcement purposes. Arizona law required HOAs to provide these documents within 10 business days of a written request from a homeowner. Patricia drafted the request letter, and Marcus hand-delivered it to Robert, the board president, at his home on a Thursday evening. Robert had looked at the letter with the expression of someone being handed a live grenade. "This is going to upset Diane," he'd said quietly. "I'm not trying to upset anyone," Marcus had replied. "I'm just exercising my rights under state law to review HOA documents." Quick question for everyone watching. Have you ever noticed how quickly people change their tune when you mention the law? Because Robert's entire demeanor shifted in that moment. "Give me the 10 days, Robert had said. "I'll get you what I can." The next 10 days were completely violation-free. Diane continued her morning patrols, and Marcus saw her slow down at his house as usual, but no notices appeared on his door. It was as if someone had told her to back off while the document request was being processed. Marcus suspected Robert had done exactly that, probably recognizing that the situation was escalating beyond his control. On day 9, Robert called Marcus's cell phone. His voice sounded strained when he said, "I have most of what you requested. Can you come by my house tonight around 7? Marcus arrived to find Robert sitting at his dining room table surrounded by file boxes, binders, and loose papers that suggested organizational chaos. "I'm going to be honest with you," Robert had said before Marcus even sat down. "I've been president for 2 years, and I had no idea how much authority Diane had taken for herself. I thought she was just enthusiastic about keeping the neighborhood nice. But going through these records to fulfill your request, I'm seeing things that concern me." He'd pushed a spreadsheet across the table. It was a violation log that Diane had maintained, showing every fine issued in Meadowbrook for the past 4 years. Marcus scanned the columns: property address, violation type, fine amount, date issued, date resolved. His address appeared 47 times in 4 months. The next most frequent address appeared 11 times over 4 years. Think about that ratio for a second. 47 violations in 4 months versus 11 violations in 4 years. Comment below if that sounds like legitimate enforcement or targeted harassment to you. There's more. Robert had continued, looking genuinely uncomfortable. The supplementary guidelines that Diane references? I asked the previous board president about them. He said they were draft proposals that Diane created 4 years ago, but they were never voted on or officially adopted. She was supposed to present them for a formal vote, but she never did. Apparently, she just started using them as if they'd been approved. Marcus had felt something cold settle in his stomach. This meant that at least half of his violations, the ones based on those guidelines, were completely invalid. More than that, it meant Diane had knowingly been issuing fines based on rules that didn't actually exist. Robert had handed over 3 more boxes, meeting minutes from the past 5 years' financial records showing how fine money was allocated, and a folder containing complaints about Diane from other homeowners that had apparently been filed with the board but never addressed. Marcus counted complaint letters from 14 different families, all describing similar experiences: excessive monitoring, frivolous violations, aggressive enforcement of minor issues while larger problems were ignored. None of these complaints had been formally discussed at board meetings. None had resulted in any action to limit Diane's authority. The other board members had apparently taken a "let Diane handle enforcement" approach and looked the other way when homeowners raised concerns. "I'm going to be frank," Robert had said, as Marcus prepared to leave with the boxes. "If you're building a case against Diane, you should know that I'm not going to fight you on it. I've had enough. This position has been nothing but headaches, and most of that is because of her. The neighborhood needs new leadership, and it needs actual rules that everyone can see and understand. If your lawyer can make that happen, I'll cooperate fully." Have you ever had an enemy accidentally become an ally? Because Robert had just handed Marcus everything he needed to dismantle Diane's little enforcement empire. Marcus delivered the boxes to Patricia the next morning. She'd spent a week reviewing everything, consulting with a paralegal who specialized in HOA document analysis, and building what she called an absolutely airtight case for harassment, selective enforcement, and board member misconduct. The plan was straightforward. Send Diane and the board a formal legal demand letter outlining the violations of state law, the evidence of selective enforcement, and the invalid fines that had been collected based on unapproved guidelines. The letter would demand full refunds of all fines paid by the Chen family, formal adoption of clear and transparent enforcement procedures in the future, and Diane's resignation from the board. If the board refused, Patricia would file a formal lawsuit and seek both compensatory damages for the harassment and legal fees. Given the strength of the evidence, Patricia was confident the board would settle rather than face the publicity and legal costs of going to trial. Marcus had initially wanted to send the demand letter immediately. Still, Patricia had suggested a different approach. First, present the evidence at a regular board meeting, give the board an opportunity to address the issues voluntarily, and only escalate to formal legal action if they refuse to cooperate. "It shows good faith on your part," Patricia had explained, "and it creates a record showing that you tried to resolve this through proper HOA channels before resorting to legal action. It also means that if we do end up in court, we can demonstrate that the board had every opportunity to fix the problem and chose not to. Now imagine standing up in front of your entire neighborhood to call out someone who's been making your life miserable. Would you have the courage?" Because Marcus was about to find out if he did. The next regular board meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday evening in the community center. These meetings were technically open to all residents, but attendance was usually sparse, typically just the board members and maybe 2 or 3 homeowners with specific issues to address. This meeting would be different. Marcus had spent the week before the meeting talking to some of the 14 families who'd filed complaints about Diane. He'd shared his plan and invited them to attend the meeting as a show of support. He'd also printed copies of the most damning documents: the violation log showing his 47 violations versus everyone else's, the complaint letters that had been filed and ignored, and a legal memo from Patricia outlining the specific Arizona statutes that Diane and the board had violated. On the night of the meeting, Marcus arrived early with Jennifer and 3 full document boxes. Patricia had decided not to attend, explaining that her presence might make things feel too aggressive too quickly, but she was available by phone if needed. Marcus set up the documents on a table near the entrance and waited as residents started to arrive. And arrive they did. Apparently, word had spread through the neighborhood. By 7 p.m., when the meeting was scheduled to start, over 60 people had packed into the community center. Some were homeowners who'd experienced similar issues with Diane. Others were curious, having heard rumors that something big was about to happen. Several people Marcus had never met introduced themselves and thanked him for finally doing something about the enforcement situation. Diane had arrived at 6:55, as punctual as ever, and had frozen in the doorway when she saw the crowd. For the first time since Marcus had met her, she looked uncertain. She'd made her way to the board table at the front of the room, but her usual confidence seemed to have evaporated. Robert called the meeting to order and worked through the standard agenda: approval of minutes from the previous meeting, financial report, and discussion of upcoming maintenance projects. The crowd waited with palpable tension. Finally, Robert reached the open forum portion where residents could raise concerns. Marcus stood up. Picture this moment. 4 months of frustration, hundreds of dollars in illegitimate fines, countless mornings of anxiety, all building to this single moment of truth. Would you have been nervous, angry, ready for confrontation? Because Marcus felt all of it at once. "My name is Marcus Chen, and I live at 2547 Desert View Drive," he'd begun, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I moved to Meadowbrook 4 months ago. In that time, I've received 47 violation notices and paid $325 in fines. I've been cited for violations that other residents commit without consequence. I've been fined based on rules that apparently exist only in a binder kept by our compliance director, and I've discovered that I'm not alone in this experience." He gestured to the crowd. "There are at least 14 families in this room who have filed formal complaints about selective enforcement, excessive monitoring, and what can only be described as harassment. These complaints were submitted to the board and ignored. Tonight, I'd like to present evidence showing that our HOA enforcement process has violated Arizona state law, that our compliance director has been issuing fines based on rules that were never properly adopted, and that this board has failed in its fiduciary duty to govern this community fairly and transparently." The room had gone completely silent. Marcus had then walked through the evidence, document by document. He'd displayed the violation log, showing his 47 citations versus everyone else's minimal violations. He'd read excerpts from complaint letters describing experiences nearly identical to his own. He'd shown photos of persistent violations at other properties that had never been addressed while he was being cited for grass clippings or slightly angled trash bins. Then he'd pulled out the supplementary guidelines document and explained that these rules, which Diane had used to justify numerous fines, had never been officially adopted by the board. He'd cited specific Arizona statutes requiring HOA rule changes to be voted on, documented in meeting minutes, and distributed to all homeowners. "According to my attorney," Marcus had said, "every fine issued based on these unapproved guidelines is legally invalid. That includes at least $200 of the fines I've paid, and based on these complaint letters, potentially thousands of dollars collected from other homeowners over the past 4 years. Have you ever watched someone's world crumble in real time? Because that's what was happening to Diane." Her face had gone pale. She'd started to speak several times but seemed unable to form coherent words. The other board members were staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to anger. Robert looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. One of the other homeowners, a woman named Patricia from 3 streets over, had stood up and said, "I was fined $75 last year for having a storage shed that was supposedly the wrong color according to these supplementary guidelines Diane's talking about. Are you telling me I can get that money back?" "According to my attorney, yes," Marcus had replied. Any fines based on rules that weren't properly adopted should be refunded. The room had erupted. People were raising their hands, sharing their own stories, pulling out their phones to check old notices and payment records. The community center had transformed from a quiet board meeting into something resembling a town hall uprising. Diane had finally found her voice, and it came out defensive and desperate. Everything I did was to protect our property values. I was maintaining standards. Someone has to enforce the rules, or this neighborhood falls apart. But you weren't enforcing the rules, Marcus had countered, keeping his tone calm despite the emotion he felt. You were selectively enforcing some rules against specific people while ignoring the same violations by others. And you were making up new rules that the rest of us never had a chance to vote on or even know existed. That's not governance. That's a power trip. Question for everyone. What's the difference between leadership and bullying? Drop your thoughts below because this distinction was about to become very clear. Robert had intervened, holding up his hands for quiet. I think it's clear we have serious issues to address. Mr. Chen, what exactly are you proposing? Marcus had pulled out Patricia's legal memo and read from it. Full refunds for all fines issued based on the supplementary guidelines. Formal adoption of clear written enforcement procedures that comply with Arizona law. Equal application of all rules across the entire community, with public documentation showing violation statistics by property, and given the evidence of misconduct, a restructuring of the board to ensure proper oversight of enforcement activities. He'd paused, looking directly at Diane. I'm also proposing that Diane Pemberton resign from the board immediately. The room had erupted again, but this time with applause. Diane had stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. You can't force me to resign. I was elected. You're right, Marcus had agreed. I can't force you to resign, but I can file a lawsuit against you personally for harassment and misconduct. My attorney has reviewed the evidence and believes we have an extremely strong case. If we go to court, you'll be responsible for your own legal fees, and if we win, you could be liable for damages well beyond the fines I've paid. Or you can resign tonight. The board can adopt proper procedures in the future, and we can all move on. Would you have offered that deal, or would you have gone straight for the lawsuit? Let me know in the comments, because Marcus's choice here says a lot about his character. Diane had looked around the room at faces that were no longer friendly or deferential. She'd built her identity around being the person who maintained standards, who kept the neighborhood perfect, who had authority and respect. In the span of 1 hour, all of that had evaporated. She'd become the villain in a story she'd thought she was the hero of. I'll need to consult with my own attorney, she'd said quietly. That's fine, Robert had replied, taking control of the situation for the first time in his presidency. But in the meantime, you're suspended from all enforcement activities effective immediately. No more violation notices, no more patrols, no more action of any kind until we resolve this. Is that clear? Diane had nodded, gathered her things, and left the meeting. Marcus watched her walk out, and instead of feeling triumphant, he felt something more complicated. Relief mixed with a strange sort of pity. She'd been wrong, absolutely and completely wrong, but she'd also been a lonely person who'd found purpose in a role that she'd twisted into something toxic. The meeting had continued for another hour as residents shared experiences, the board discussed next steps, and Marcus answered questions about the legal process. By the time everyone left, there was a clear consensus. The HOA needed reform, the board needed new leadership, and the neighborhood needed to come together to rebuild trust. The aftermath unfolded over the following weeks, with a momentum that surprised even Marcus. Diane submitted her resignation letter 3 days after the board meeting, delivered by email at 10 p.m. on a Friday night. The letter was brief and contained no apology, just a formal statement that she was stepping down from her position effective immediately due to personal reasons and philosophical differences with the board's direction. Have you noticed how people who abuse power rarely actually apologize? They disappear and pretend it never happened. Drop a comment if you've experienced this kind of non-apology before. Robert, to his credit, took the situation seriously. He called an emergency board meeting for the following week and invited Marcus to attend as an observer and consultant. The purpose of the meeting was to address the immediate fallout, how to handle refund requests, how to establish legitimate enforcement procedures in the future, and how to rebuild community trust. Patricia attended this meeting as Marcus's legal representative, and her presence changed the entire dynamic. The board members, now acutely aware that they could face personal liability for governance failures, listened intently as she explained their legal obligations under Arizona law. She'd prepared a detailed memo outlining exactly what the board needed to do to come into compliance with state statutes. First, the supplementary guidelines had to be formally abandoned. Any rule that the HOA wanted to enforce needed to be properly voted on, documented in meeting minutes, and distributed to all residents with a 30-day notice period before enforcement began. No more secret binders, no more selective application of rules that existed only in someone's head. Second, the board needed to conduct a comprehensive audit of all violations issued over the past 4 years based on the invalid supplementary guidelines. Every homeowner who'd been fined based on these non-existent rules was entitled to a full refund. Patricia estimated this could cost the HOA between $15,000 and $20,000, which would require a special assessment or dipping into reserve funds. Third, enforcement procedures needed to be standardized. This meant creating a formal process where alleged violations were photographed, documented with specific covenant citations, and sent to homeowners with a 10-day cure period before any fine was issued. It meant establishing an appeal process where homeowners could challenge violations before a neutral panel of board members, not just the person who issued the citation. And it meant publishing quarterly reports showing enforcement statistics for the entire community so residents could see that rules were being applied uniformly. Now here's a question. Why don't more HOAs operate this way from the beginning? Think about how much drama and legal expense could be avoided with simple transparency. The board voted unanimously to implement all of Patricia's recommendations. Robert then did something that Marcus hadn't expected. He announced that he would be stepping down as president at the end of his term in 3 months and would not seek re-election. The other board members, seemingly exhausted by the entire ordeal, indicated they would likely do the same. "This neighborhood needs fresh leadership," Robert had said, looking directly at Marcus. "People who actually want to be here and who understand that an HOA is supposed to serve the community, not police it. I took this position because someone had to, but my heart was never really in it. That's how Diane was able to take so much control. I wasn't paying attention, and I should have been." It was the most honest thing Marcus had heard from any board member since moving to Meadowbrook. The refund process began immediately. The treasurer, a woman named Sandra, who'd been quietly horrified by the evidence Marcus presented, took charge of reviewing violation records and calculating refunds. She worked through weekends to process the paperwork, and within 2 weeks, checks started going out to affected homeowners. Marcus received a refund check for $200, covering all fines that had been based on the invalid supplementary guidelines. 17 other families received refunds ranging from $50 to $350. The total amount refunded came to just over $18,000, money that came directly from HOA reserve funds, and would need to be replenished through a small special assessment spread across all properties. Quick question. How do you think the other homeowners reacted when they found out they'd have to chip in to cover refunds for Diane's misconduct? The answer might surprise you. Instead of anger, most residents expressed support. A survey went out asking whether homeowners approved of using reserve funds for the refunds, and 87% voted yes. The general sentiment was that cleaning up past mistakes was worth a small assessment if it meant building a better system in the future. Several people explicitly stated in the survey comments that they were relieved someone had finally stood up to Diane and that the cost was worth it to prevent future abuse. There were, of course, some dissenters. A handful of residents who'd been friendly with Diane or who shared her strict interpretation of property maintenance standards felt that Marcus had overreacted and that the neighborhood would decline without rigorous enforcement. One neighbor sent an anonymous letter to the board claiming that Marcus's lawsuit threat had created a hostile environment and that property values would suffer if standards weren't maintained. But these voices were in the minority. The overwhelming response from the community was relief and gratitude that someone had been willing to challenge a system that most people had accepted as unchangeable. The real transformation began when the board announced special elections for all positions to be held in 60 days. This gave residents time to consider running and allowed the current board to implement the new procedures and complete the refund process before transitioning out. The election announcement included a detailed explanation of what board service entailed, the time commitment required, and the legal responsibilities involved. To everyone's surprise, including his own, Marcus found himself being approached repeatedly by neighbors asking him to run for board president. The idea had never occurred to him. He'd just wanted to stop being harassed, not take on community leadership. But as more people encouraged him, explaining that the neighborhood needed someone who understood both the legal requirements and the importance of fair governance, he started to consider it seriously. Jennifer had been hesitant at first. "We moved here to have a peaceful life, not to run the HOA," she'd pointed out reasonably. But she'd also seen how engaged Marcus had become during the process of challenging Diane, how he'd discovered skills in research, organization, and public speaking that his software engineering job rarely required. "If you want to do it," she'd finally said, "I'll support you. Just promise me you won't turn into Diane. Have you ever been scared of becoming the thing you fought against? That's a real concern." And Marcus took it seriously. He'd called Patricia to ask her advice. "Should I run for the board? And if I do, how do I make sure I don't end up abusing authority the same way Diane did?" Patricia had laughed. "The fact that you're asking that question tells me you're exactly the kind of person who should be on the board. People who abuse power don't worry about abusing power. They think they're entitled to it. You're worried about doing the right thing, which means you'll probably succeed at it." Marcus decided to run, but not alone. He approached 3 other homeowners who'd been vocal during the meeting and who seemed to share his vision for transparent, service-oriented HOA governance. Together, they formed a slate of candidates running on a platform of reform: clear rules, equal enforcement, transparent finances, and community engagement. The campaign period was unlike anything Meadowbrook had seen before. Previous elections had been quiet affairs where whoever was willing to volunteer got the position by default. This time, there were 2 competing slates of candidates and an actual debate about the neighborhood's future direction. Marcus's reform slate held a town hall meeting at the community center, where they outlined their specific plans and answered questions for over 2 hours. The opposing slate consisted of homeowners who wanted stricter enforcement and were concerned that reform meant declining standards. Their main candidate for president was a man named Douglas, who'd been friends with Diane and believed she'd been unfairly targeted. Douglas argued that property values depended on rigid maintenance standards and that Marcus's approach would lead to chaos. Here's an interesting question. Can a community have both freedom and order? That's what this election was about. The town hall meeting revealed the philosophical divide clearly. Douglas stood up during the question period and asked, "If we adopt your relaxed approach to enforcement, what's to stop people from letting their properties deteriorate? What happens when someone decides not to maintain their lawn or parks an RV in their driveway permanently?" Marcus had been ready for this question. "First, I'm not proposing relaxed enforcement. I'm proposing fair and transparent enforcement. The current covenant rules remain in effect, but they'll be applied equally to everyone, not selectively based on who Diane happened to be watching that week. Second, We're proposing a tiered system where minor violations get friendly reminders before fines, and major violations that genuinely impact property values get addressed through a formal process with due process protections for homeowners. And third, we're proposing that the community vote on any new rules before they're enforced, so everyone has a voice in what standards we're maintaining. A woman in the back had raised her hand and added, "I've lived here 9 years, and honestly, the neighborhood looked fine before Diane went on her enforcement spree. We don't need someone measuring mailbox angles with a protractor. We need reasonable people making reasonable decisions." The applause that followed suggested most attendees agreed. Question for you. Would you rather live somewhere with perfect lawns and constant surveillance, or somewhere with minor imperfections and actual freedom? Let me know what matters more to you in the comments. Election day arrived on a warm Saturday in September. Voting took place in the community center from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., and turnout was unprecedented. In previous elections, 30% of homeowners bothered to vote. This time, over 75% showed up, many bringing their families and treating it as a community event. Marcus spent the day at the polling location, not campaigning since that wasn't allowed, but greeting neighbors and thanking people for participating. He'd seen Diane once during the voting period, arriving mid-morning to cast her ballot. She'd avoided eye contact with him, voted quickly, and left without speaking to anyone. He'd felt that same complicated mix of emotions, relief that she was no longer a threat, but also sadness at how isolated she'd become. The votes were counted that evening, with representatives from both slates observing the process. When the results were announced, Marcus's reform slate had won every single position by margins ranging from 63 to 72%. It was a complete mandate for change. Marcus stood at the front of the community center as the results were read, Jennifer beside him, and felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He'd successfully challenged an abusive system, but now he had to build something better in its place. This was the part that would actually matter in the long run. The new board was sworn in 2 weeks later at a ceremony that felt more like a community celebration than an administrative formality. Over 100 residents attended, many bringing potluck dishes and turning it into an impromptu neighborhood party. Robert, completing his final act as outgoing president, handed Marcus a thick binder containing all the HOA's official documents and said, "Do better than we did. That's all I ask." Marcus's first official act as board president was to propose a community covenant review committee. Instead of the board unilaterally deciding what rules should exist, they would form a committee of 15 residents representing different streets and demographics in Meadowbrook. This committee would spend 3 months reviewing the existing covenant, gathering community input, and proposing revisions that the entire neighborhood would then vote on. Have you ever noticed how much better rules work when the people affected by them actually help create them? That's Democratic Governance 101, but somehow HOAs forget this constantly. The review committee process was intensive but ultimately successful. They held monthly open forums where any resident could propose changes or voice concerns. They created online surveys to gather input from people who couldn't attend meetings. They consulted with Patricia to ensure any proposed rules would comply with Arizona law. The revised covenant they produced was actually shorter and clearer than the original. Gone were obscure provisions about mailbox angles and trash bin positioning. The remaining were common-sense rules about property maintenance, noise levels, and aesthetic standards that genuinely impacted property values and community quality of life. The new covenant included explicit provisions about enforcement procedures, appeal rights, and transparency requirements. Most importantly, it included a provision that any board member who engaged in selective enforcement or harassment could be removed by a simple majority vote of homeowners at a special meeting. This created a built-in safeguard against another Diane situation ever developing. The community voted to adopt the revised covenant in December, 7 months after Marcus had first stood up at that pivotal board meeting. The vote was 89% in favor. Meadowbrook had officially transformed from a neighborhood ruled by petty tyranny into a community governed by consensus. But what happened to Diane? You may wonder if there's a satisfying ending to her story. The answer is complicated, which is often how real life works. Diane had remained in her home throughout the transition period, but she'd become increasingly isolated. She no longer walked the neighborhood on morning patrols. She rarely left her house except for necessary errands. Neighbors who'd been friendly with her reported that she seemed depressed and angry, convinced that she'd been unfairly scapegoated for simply trying to maintain standards. Marcus had no contact with her until a surprising encounter 4 months after the election. He'd been working in his front yard on a Saturday morning when Diane had walked past on the sidewalk. For the first time since everything had exploded, she'd stopped and looked at him. "Your yard looks nice," she'd said quietly. Marcus had been so surprised he'd almost dropped his gardening shears. "Thank you," he'd managed to reply. There'd been a long pause, and for a moment Marcus thought Diane might actually apologize or try to explain herself. Instead, she'd said, "I really did think I was helping. I thought if I just enforced the rules strictly enough, the neighborhood would be perfect and everyone would be happy." "But people weren't happy," Marcus had replied, keeping his tone gentle. "They were stressed and anxious and felt like they were being watched constantly. Rules are important, but so is trust and flexibility and treating your neighbors like human beings instead of violations waiting to happen." Diane had nodded slowly, though Marcus couldn't tell if she actually understood or was acknowledging his words. "I hear you're doing a good job as president," she'd said. "People seem pleased." "I'm trying," Marcus had answered honestly. "Mostly, I'm just trying to listen and be fair. It's harder than I expected, but it's also more rewarding." Here's a reflection question. Can someone who's caused harm ever truly understand what they did wrong? I'm not sure Marcus ever got a clear answer with Diane, and maybe that's okay. She'd continued her walk after that brief conversation, and Marcus had returned to his gardening. They'd had a few similar brief exchanges over the following months, never long conversations, but small moments of civil acknowledgement that suggested Diane was slowly processing what had happened and her role in it. 6 months into Marcus's presidency, something unexpected happened. Diane listed her house for sale and moved to a different community about 40 minutes away. Marcus heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd specifically chosen a non-HOA neighborhood where there were no rules about property maintenance and no positions of authority for her to either enforce or be tempted by. It was probably the best outcome for everyone. Diane could live somewhere that didn't trigger her controlling impulses, and Meadowbrook could continue building its new culture without the awkwardness of having its former enforcer still in residence. The transformation of Meadowbrook over Marcus's first year as president was remarkable. Enforcement violations dropped by 60%, not because standards had declined, but because the new friendly reminder system meant most issues were resolved before fines became necessary. The quarterly enforcement reports showed violations being issued evenly across the community with no patterns of targeting or selective application. Property values in Meadowbrook actually increased slightly compared to similar neighborhoods in the area, dispelling the myth that strict enforcement was necessary for maintaining home values. Real estate agents started marketing properties in the community by emphasizing the reformed HOA and resident-friendly governance, which became a selling point rather than a concern. Quick question. Have you ever noticed that communities work better when people trust each other instead of policing each other? Seems obvious, but it's amazing how many HOAs miss this basic truth. Marcus served a successful 3-year term as president and then voluntarily stepped down, believing that regular rotation of leadership was healthy for the community. The lessons learned from the Diane situation had become embedded in Meadowbrook's culture. Transparency matters, fairness matters, and power without accountability inevitably corrupts even well-meaning people. Jennifer had watched her husband grow throughout the experience, developing leadership skills and confidence he hadn't known he possessed. The dream home that had nearly become a nightmare had transformed into something even better, a true community where they felt valued and heard. For Marcus personally, the experience had taught him something profound about standing up for yourself and others. He'd spent 4 months being intimidated by someone with a clipboard and a title, convinced that fighting back would be too difficult or expensive or risky. In the end, all it had taken was documentation, knowledge of his rights, and the courage to speak up publicly about unfairness. The legal costs had been minimal, just Patricia's initial consultation fee and a few $100s for document preparation, all of which had been offset by the refund of invalid fines. The emotional cost of staying silent and continuing to be harassed would have been far higher. Here's the most important question I can ask you. How long will you tolerate injustice before you decide to do something about it? Because Marcus's story shows that challenging unfairness doesn't require being wealthy or powerful or even particularly brave. It requires being informed, persistent, and willing to stand up publicly for what's right. 3 years after that pivotal board meeting, Marcus received a message through the HOA email system from a homeowner in a different Phoenix suburb. The person had heard about Meadowbrook's transformation through word of mouth and was dealing with a similar situation, an HOA board member who'd gone rogue with enforcement and was targeting specific residents. "I read about what you did," the email said, "and I was wondering if you could share advice on how to fight back against selective enforcement. I've been documenting everything, but I don't know what my next steps should be." Marcus had smiled and immediately started typing a response. He'd shared Patricia's contact information, outlined the documentation strategies that had worked for him, explained the Arizona statutes that protected homeowners from harassment, and most importantly, encouraged the person to find allies in their community because collective action was always more powerful than individual complaints. That email was the first of many. Over the years, Marcus became an informal resource for people dealing with HOA disputes across the Phoenix area. He'd never intended to become an advocate for HOA reform, but his experience had given him expertise and credibility that could help others. He'd even given a presentation at a statewide conference on community association management, titled "From Enforcement to Engagement: How One HOA Transformed Through Transparency." The room had been packed with board members, property managers, and homeowners, all hungry for examples of governance done right. Think about this. One person standing up created ripples that spread far beyond their own neighborhood. That's the power of refusing to accept abuse of authority. The lasting impact of Marcus's challenge to Diane extended beyond just Meadowbrook or even his informal advocacy work. Arizona eventually updated its HOA statutes to include stronger transparency requirements and more explicit protections for homeowners facing selective enforcement, changes that advocates attributed partly to high-profile cases like Marcus's that had demonstrated the need for reform. Diane's story, meanwhile, took its own unexpected turn. 2 years after moving to her non-HOA neighborhood, she'd started volunteering at a community mediation center, helping resolve disputes between neighbors without resorting to legal action. Someone who knew about her Meadowbrook history had asked her why she'd chosen that particular volunteer role. "I understand what it's like when conflicts spiral out of control," she'd reportedly said. "I want to help people find solutions before they reach the point where someone feels they need to hire a lawyer or file a lawsuit. Communication and compromise work better than enforcement and punishment." Marcus heard this through mutual acquaintances and felt a genuine sense of hope. Maybe Diane had learned something after all. Being confronted with the consequences of her actions forced a kind of growth that wouldn't have happened if Marcus had just kept paying fines and suffering in silence. Here's my final question for you. What would your neighborhood, your workplace, your community look like if everyone who witnessed unfairness actually challenged it? Drop your answer in the comments, because this is the lesson that extends far beyond HOA disputes. Marcus's story wasn't really about homeowner associations or violation notices or even one power-hungry neighbor. It was about the fundamental human choice between accepting injustice for the sake of peace and confronting injustice despite the discomfort that comes with conflict. Every time someone pays an unjust fine without questioning it, every time someone accepts selective enforcement because challenging it seems too difficult, every time someone stays silent while watching a neighbor be harassed, the system perpetuates itself. But every time someone stands up, documents the abuse, demands accountability, and refuses to be intimidated by titles or authority, the system cracks a little more. Marcus and Jennifer still live in their Meadowbrook home. Their neighborhood has become known as one of the most well-governed HOA communities in Phoenix, regularly cited as an example of how transparency and fairness create better outcomes than rigid enforcement and fear. Property values have remained strong, the common areas are beautifully maintained, and most importantly, residents actually enjoy living there instead of constantly worrying about violation notices. On quiet mornings, Marcus sometimes thinks about that first encounter with Diane at his front door, her cold welcome and immediate citation about visible boxes in his garage. If someone had told him then that 4 months later he'd be standing in front of 60 angry neighbors presenting evidence of HOA corruption, and that 3 years later he'd be president of that same HOA, he would have thought it was absurd. But life has a way of pushing us into roles we never imagined for ourselves. Sometimes the worst experiences become catalysts for the most meaningful changes. Sometimes the person making your life miserable is actually giving you an opportunity to discover the strength you didn't know you had. The mailbox that Diane once measured with obsessive precision still stands at the same slightly imperfect angle it always did. The trash bins still get placed on the curb, sometimes precisely parallel, sometimes slightly askew, depending on how rushed Marcus is on Wednesday evenings. The garden hose occasionally remains visible on the side of the house for a day or two after car washing. None of it matters because Meadowbrook finally learned what healthy community governance looks like. Rules that serve people, not people who serve rules. Enforcement that comes from care, not control. And leadership that empowers residents instead of terrorizing them. So here's my challenge to you. If you're dealing with an HOA Karen, a petty authority figure, or any system that seems designed to punish rather than support, ask yourself what Marcus would do. Document everything. Know your rights. Find your allies. Stand up publicly, and never ever accept abuse of power just because challenging it feels uncomfortable. Because the only thing worse than the stress of confronting injustice is the slow erosion of your peace and dignity that comes from tolerating it indefinitely, Marcus chose confrontation, and it changed not just his life, but an entire community's culture. That same choice is available to anyone willing to take it. The dream home is worth fighting for, the peaceful neighborhood is worth defending, and the satisfaction of watching someone who abused their authority face actual consequences? That's worth every uncomfortable moment, every anxious night, and every dollar spent on legal advice. Justice doesn't always prevail. But in Marcus Chen's case, on that warm Tuesday evening in a community center in Phoenix, Arizona, it absolutely did. And that victory continues to echo through every fair enforcement decision, every transparent board meeting, and every homeowner in Meadowbrook who no longer dreads coming home to find a violation notice on their door. What's your HOA horror story, and what are you going to do about it? The comment section is waiting for your answer.